The wind had a voice in these mountains, and tonight it was screaming. It was a raw, keening sound that scraped against the log walls of the cabin and clawed at the packed dirt, chinking. The year was 1891, and winter had come to the Montana wilderness not as a gentle blanket of white, but as a predator, all teeth and ice. The snow fell not in flakes, but in a blinding, horizontal sheet, erasing the world, erasing the sky, erasing any memory of a sun. Inside the small, solitary cabin, Eli Crow moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who had learned to measure his life in cords of wood and sacks of flour. He was not a young man anymore, but the muscles in his back and shoulders were coiled and dense from a lifetime of hard labor. He fed another log into the pot-belly stove, the iron door groaning in protest. The fire within hissed, a cornered animal fighting back against the cold that seeped through the very timber of the walls. He was far from any town, miles from the nearest neighbor he had never met, and that was how he wanted it. Solitude was a balm for a soul that had seen too much of what men did to one another. Here, the only cruelty was the weather, and that was an honest cruelty, without malice or deceit. He pulled his worn sheepskin coat on and picked up his axe. The woodpile outside was shrinking faster than he liked. Another day of the storm, maybe two, and he would be burning furniture. He braced himself, pushed the heavy plank door open, and stepped into a world of white fury. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. Snow immediately crusted his beard and eyelashes. He squinted against the gale, his world reduced to the 10 feet between his door and the woodpile. He worked with a practiced, steady rhythm, the axe rising and falling, the sharp crack of splitting pine a defiant sound against the howl of the storm. It was a rhythm that occupied his hands and quieted his mind. Chop, stack, chop, stack. He did not have to think about the faces that sometimes surfaced in the flames of the fire, or the phantom sounds of laughter that the wind sometimes carried from an empty corner of the cabin. But then he heard it. It was different from the wind's usual song. It was higher, thinner, a thread of sound, almost lost in the roar. He stopped, axe held mid-swing, head tilted. He listened. An animal, most likely. A coyote caught in a drift, or a cougar crying out for a mate. He had heard such things before. He dismissed it and raised the axe again. There it was again. Closer this time. It was not an animal. It was human. A faint, desperate cry that the wind snatched and tore to pieces. But he had heard it. A fool's errand to go looking. To leave the small circle of warmth and light for the frozen chaos was to invite death. A man could get lost in 5 paces, wander in circles until he froze solid, a statue of his own bad judgment. His mind told him to go back inside, bolt the door, and add another log to the fire. Whatever was out there was already claimed by the storm. It was the wilderness's business, not his. But his body did not move. He stood frozen, listening, the snow piling up on his shoulders. The sound came a third time, weaker now, almost a sigh. And it was the weakness, the finality of it, that moved him. He could not leave it. He could not sit by his fire for the rest of the winter knowing he had heard that sound and done nothing. Whatever ghosts haunted him, he would not add a fresh one to their ranks. He jammed the axe into the chopping block and turned, pulling his hat down low. He began to walk, following a memory of the sound, his boots sinking deep into the powder. He had no direction, no trail to follow. He was walking blind, guided only by a ghost of a whisper. He fought the wind, his body a bulwark against the storm's rage. The cold was a living thing, seeping through his coat, his wool shirt, his very bones. He began to think he had imagined it, that the loneliness was finally making him hear things that were not there. He was about to turn back when his boot struck something soft. He looked down. At first, it was just a mound in the snow, another drift, but there was a darkness to it, a shape that did not belong. He knelt, his gloved hands brushing away the snow. It was a coat, tattered and thin, and beneath it, a body. He worked faster, his heart a cold hammer in his chest. He uncovered a tangle of dark hair, dusted with white like a spider's web in frost. Then a face, pale as marble, lips the color of a deep bruise. A woman. She was so still, so utterly lifeless. He thought he was too late. He pressed his fingers against her neck, fumbling with the glove, searching for the faint, thready beat of life. For a moment, there was nothing. Then he felt it, a flutter, weak. But there, she was alive, barely. He saw the state of her. The coat was a pathetic rag, offering no real protection. Beneath it, she wore only a thin nightgown, now frozen stiff. Her feet were bare, blue and swollen. He swore, a harsh, guttural sound lost to the wind. Who in God's name would be out here, dressed for bed in the middle of the worst blizzard he had seen in a decade? There was no time for questions. He scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a bird made of ice and bone. Her head lolled back against his shoulder, and a small, unconscious sigh escaped her lips. He turned and began the slow, arduous journey back to the cabin, his own warmth a desperate, failing shield against the cold that clung to her. Each step was a battle. The cabin, which had seemed so close, was now a distant haven on the other side of a frozen hell. He focused on the faint orange glow of its window, a lone ember in a universe of white. He finally stumbled through the door, kicking it shut behind him, the sudden silence of the room deafening after the storm's roar. He did not lay her on his cot. Not yet. She would soak it through. He laid her gently on the bearskin rug before the stove, her body making a soft, crunching sound as the ice in her clothes began to yield to the room's heat. He worked with a grim, focused intensity. He stoked the fire until the stove glowed a dull red, the metal ticking as it expanded. Then he turned back to her. Her clothes had to come off. He hesitated for only a second. It was not about modesty. It was about survival. Her frozen garments were leeching the life from her. He took his knife and carefully cut the tattered coat away. Then the thin, frozen cotton of her nightgown. Her skin was ghostly white, almost translucent, and marred by ugly, purplish bruises that stood out like ink stains on parchment. They bloomed across her ribs and along her arms. On her wrists, he saw them. Raw, chafed rings of broken skin, rope marks, old and new. Someone had bound her. A cold, hard anger settled in Eli's gut. This was not the work of the storm. This was the work of a man. The honest cruelty of the wilderness was one thing. He understood that. This was something else entirely. This was a different kind of monster. He pushed the thought aside. He had to get her warm. He filled a kettle and set it on the stove, then fetched every spare blanket he owned. He began to rub her limbs, starting with her feet, trying to force circulation back into the frozen tissues. He worked gently, methodically, fighting the frost that had claimed her. Her skin was so cold it felt like stone. Hours passed. The storm raged on. But inside the small cabin, a different kind of battle was being fought. Eli kept vigil, feeding the fire, warming blankets, and forcing spoonfuls of warm broth between her lips whenever she stirred enough to swallow. She remained unconscious, lost in a place he could not reach. Sometime deep in the night, she began to murmur. Her words were slurred, broken fragments of a fevered dream, names he did not recognize. Please for someone to stop, then... Her voice became suddenly clear, a desperate, shivering whisper that cut through the quiet room. I need you tonight. The words hung in the air, intimate and raw. He froze, his hand hovering over her forehead. She was not speaking to him. She was speaking to a phantom from the nightmare she was trapped in. Her eyes fluttered, but they did not open. The plea was followed by a soft whimper. And then she fell silent again, sinking back into the depths. Eli sat back on his heels, the weight of her words settling on him. He felt like a trespasser, an unwilling audience to the most private corners of her pain. He looked at her face, truly looked at it for the first time. Even with the bruises and the deathly pallor, he could see she had been beautiful. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, a mouth that was probably meant to smile. Now, it was just a thin, grim line. Her dark hair, now dry, fanned out around her head on the dark fur of the rug. She looked like a fallen angel, broken by her descent to earth. He stayed by her side, the rhythm of his own breathing a steady counterpoint to her shallow, ragged breaths. He watched and he waited, the first hint of a gray. Stormlight dawn was filtering through the window when her eyes finally opened. They were not the eyes of someone waking from sleep. They were wide, dark, and hollow, filled with a terror so profound it made him ache. They darted around the unfamiliar room, taking in the log walls, the dying fire, the strange man kneeling beside her. Her body went rigid. A small, animal sound of fear escaped her throat. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and calm, the way one speaks to a spooked horse. "You are safe here." She stared at him, her gaze so intense it felt like he was being weighed and measured. She tried to push herself up but fell back with a gasp of pain, her limbs still weak and unresponsive. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "My cabin. I found you in the snow." Her eyes darted to the door, as if expecting it to burst open. "He will find me." The words were flat, a statement of inevitable fact. "No one is finding anyone in this storm," Eli said. "It is just you and me." He held out a tin cup of broth. "You need to drink this. Get your strength back." She stared at the cup, then back at his face. Trust was a foreign country to her, and she had no passport. But the smell of the broth, the deep, savory scent of life and sustenance, was a powerful argument. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out a trembling hand. He helped her guide the cup to her lips. She drank, her throat working, the warm liquid a small miracle inside her. When she finished, she sank back, exhausted by the effort. He did not press her with questions. He did not ask for her name or where she came from. He could see the story written on her skin, in the haunted landscape of her eyes. He simply sat in silence, a quiet guardian in the dim light of the cabin, letting her find her own way back to the world of the living. In the days that followed, a fragile routine formed, dictated by the storm that kept them prisoners. A hard silence settled between them, but it was not an empty one. It was a silence filled with unspoken things. He would cook their meager meals of salted meat and beans, and she would eat without a word, her eyes constantly scanning the room, her body tensed for a blow that never came. She flinched at the sound of him chopping more wood inside, the sharp crack of the axe making her jump. She would not sleep on the cot he offered her. Instead, she would curl up in the blankets on the floor by the stove, as close to the fire as she could get, and she would not close her eyes until she saw him settled in his chair, a silent sentinel watching over her. He learned her fears through observation, the way she pulled her hands into the sleeves of her borrowed shirt, hiding the marks on her wrists, the way she would stare into the fire for hours, her expression vacant, lost in a place he could not imagine. He saw the way she held herself, as if she were trying to take up as little space as possible, to become invisible. He did not try to fill the silence with meaningless talk. He understood that words had been used as weapons against her. Instead, he offered her the comfort of his steady, predictable presence. He mended a stirrup, cleaned his rifle, sharpened his knives. Simple, quiet tasks that reassured her he was not a threat. And, little by little, he saw the tension in her shoulders ease. The hunted look in her eyes began to soften, replaced by a deep, abiding weariness. She would not tell him her name. When he asked once, gently, she simply shook her head, her lips pressed into a tight line. "He cannot find me if I do not have a name," she had whispered. She would only say that she had run. "From my husband," she offered one evening, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "From something worse than death." That was all. She built a wall of silence around her past, and he did not try to breach it. He knew another blizzard was coming on the heels of the first one. He could feel it in the ache of his bones, see it in the sullen, bruised color of the sky. He took inventory of his supplies. They were dangerously low. A few pounds of flour, half a slab of bacon, some dried beans, and coffee. It would not be enough if they were snowed in for another week, which seemed more and more likely. The tension in the small cabin grew taut. It was no longer just her fear that filled the space between them, but the gnawing anxiety of starvation. Their survival was now bound together, a shared fate in the heart of the unforgiving winter. One night, the fourth since he had found her, the scream tore through the cabin. It was not a sound of simple fear. It was a sound of pure, soul-shattering agony, ripped from the deepest part of her. Eli was on his feet in an instant. She was sitting bolt upright on her makeshift bed, her eyes wide with unseeing terror, her hands clawing at the air. She was trapped in the nightmare, reliving the horror she had fled. He moved to her side, his instincts taking over. He did not touch her at first, just spoke her name, but she had no name. "Hey," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You are here. You are safe." She did not hear him. She began to sob, great, racking gasps that shook her entire body. He could not stand to see it. He reached out and put his hands on her shoulders. She flinched violently, but he did not let go. He held her steady, a living anchor in the storm of her memories. "It is all right," he murmured, over and over. "I am here. It is all right." Slowly, the terror receded from her eyes, replaced by a dawning awareness. She focused on his face, her breathing still coming in ragged hitches. She looked at his hands on her shoulders, solid and warm. She was not in that dark place anymore. She was here, in this small, warm cabin, with this quiet, steady man. She sagged against him, the fight going out of her. He pulled the blankets around her trembling frame, holding her until the shaking subsided. He could feel the fragile beat of her heart against his hand. He was about to pull away, to give her back her space, when her hand shot out and grabbed his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Do not let go," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Please." He looked down at her. Her face was tilted up to his, her eyes shimmering in the firelight. And in their depths, he saw a profound and desperate shift. The raw fear was still there, but it was tangled now with something else, a flicker of hope, a desperate, starving need for connection, and beneath it all, a nascent spark of desire, not for a body, but for the safety and warmth his presence represented. It was the look of a woman who had been so long in the cold that she had forgotten what it felt to be warm, and now that she had found it, she would rather die than lose it. He did not let go. He sat beside her on the floor, his arm around her, the silence returning, but changed now. It was heavier, charged with a new and dangerous intimacy. They stayed like that for a long time, the fire casting long shadows on the walls, the wind howling its lonely song outside. Finally, she pulled back just enough to look at him, her gaze clear for the first time. The ghosts were still there, lingering in the shadows of her eyes, but they had retreated. She was present. She was here. "Clara," she said, her voice soft but steady. "My name is Clara." She offered him the name like a fragile gift, the first piece of herself she had dared to reclaim. She did not offer him a last name. The past was still a locked room, but she had opened the door, just a crack, and invited him to stand on the threshold. And in the heart of that brutal Montana winter, it felt like the first day of spring. The morning after, she gave him her name. Something in the air of the cabin shifted. The silence was still there, a thick blanket woven into the log walls. But it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of observation, of two people learning the shape of each other in the small, firelit world they shared. Her name was Clara. It was a simple, solid thing, and having it gave Eli a place to anchor his thoughts. She was no longer just the woman from the snow. She was Clara. He watched her that morning as she ate her small portion of oatmeal. Her movements still hesitant, but less like those of a cornered animal. The deep hollows under her eyes remained, but the frantic, hunted look had begun to recede. He knew then that surviving the storm was not enough. If she was to truly live, she needed to be more than a victim huddled by a fire. She needed to know she was capable. She needed to feel the strength in her own hands. After their meal, he stood and pulled on his heavy coat. "Come," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "There is work to be done." She looked up, a flicker of the old fear in her eyes. But she did not refuse. She bundled herself in the spare woolens he had given her and followed him to the door. The wind had lessened, but the cold was a blade. The world outside was a study in white and gray. The snow drifted up to the cabin's windowsills, the pines heavy and stooped under their frozen load. He led her to the woodpile. He picked up the heavy felling axe and handed it to her. It was far too big, its weight pulling her down. She staggered, her thin arms struggling to keep it upright. "This is how you stay warm," he said simply. "This is how you stay alive. You make your own heat." He took a smaller hand axe from the chopping block and showed her how to hold it, how to brace her feet, how to let the weight of the tool do the work. His instructions were sparse, his movements economical. He did not crowd her, did not touch her unless it was to adjust her grip on the handle. He demonstrated on a small log, the sharp, satisfying crack of the wood splitting cleanly in two. Then he stepped back. "Your turn." Her first few attempts were clumsy, pathetic. The axe glanced off the wood with a dull thud, jarring her arms. She gritted her teeth, frustration tightening her jaw. In another life, a man shouting at her for her failure would have followed. She braced for it, but the criticism never came. Eli just stood there, watching, his expression unreadable. He waited with a patience that was more comforting than any kind word. She tried again and again. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the freezing air. Her breath came in white plumes. Finally, with a cry that was part anger and part effort, she brought the axe down hard. The wood groaned, split, and fell apart. She stared at the 2 pieces of firewood at her feet as if she had performed a miracle. A small, trembling smile touched her lips. It was the first time he had seen her smile. "Good," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Now do it again." They worked until her arms trembled with exhaustion. He showed her how to stack the wood so the air could dry it. A small but essential piece of wilderness knowledge. Each split log was a victory against the cold that had nearly claimed her. The next day, he took her to the lean-to that served as a stable for his 2 horses. They were sturdy, shaggy beasts, their breath steaming in the enclosure. Clara shrank back. They were so large, so powerful. "They will not hurt you," Eli said. He walked up to the gelding, murmuring to it softly, his calloused hand stroking the horse's thick winter coat. "This is Jed. He is stubborn, but honest. You have to let him know you are not afraid." He taught her how to groom the horse, the rhythmic pull of the curry comb a soothing sound in the quiet stable. He showed her how to check their hooves for ice and how to measure out their feed. She was timid at first, her touch light and uncertain. But the animal's quiet warmth, the soft nicker it gave when she found an itchy spot behind its ear, seemed to calm her. Here was a power that was not cruel, a strength that could be gentle. Her hands began to heal. The raw skin on her wrists had closed over, the angry red fading to a pale pink. The work with the wood and the horses was hard, and it broke the skin on her palms in new places. But these were different wounds. These were the calluses of effort, not of bondage. They were marks of her own making. The 3rd lesson was the hardest. After their evening meal, he laid his rifle on the table between them. It was a Winchester, its wooden stock worn smooth with use, the blued steel of the barrel gleaming in the lamplight. It was a beautiful and terrible thing. Clara stared at it, her hands clenched in her lap. A gun was a man's tool. It was an instrument of noise and violence and death. "You need to know how to use this," Eli said, his voice flat. He saw the revulsion on her face. "Not just for hunting. Out here, you are your only protection. You cannot rely on anyone else to keep you safe. You must be able to do it yourself." He unloaded the weapon, showing her the brass cartridges, explaining the mechanism with a detached, clinical precision. He made her hold it, feel its weight and balance. It was heavy, colder than the axe had been. It felt alien in her hands. "A gun is not evil. Clara," he said, using her name, his voice softening slightly. "It is a tool. What matters is the heart of the person holding it." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and saw the deep sadness in his eyes. She understood that he was not just teaching her about survival. He was teaching her about power. He was giving her back the thing that had been stolen from her, piece by piece, the ability to say no, the ability to defend her own life. In the evenings, as the blizzard continued to lock them away from the world, they began to talk. The words came slowly at first, small offerings laid carefully in the space between them. They were not talking about the past, not yet. They were talking about small things, safe things. "What did you miss the most when you were out there?" he asked one night, his eyes on the stew he was stirring in the pot over the fire. She thought for a long time. "The color yellow," she finally said, her voice so soft he had to strain to hear it. "I remember the sunflowers in Kansas, fields of them. It was like the sun had fallen to earth." He nodded, a picture of it forming in his mind. "I miss the taste of peaches," he admitted. "A ripe peach in summer, the juice running down your chin. I have not had one in years." They talked about the things they remembered from before the cold had settled into their lives. She described the endless, flat horizon of the prairie, the smell of rain on dry dust. He told her about the feel of a ship on the ocean, a life he had lived long before he came to the mountains. These were memories from a time before their worlds had broken. Sharing them was like opening a window in a stuffy room, letting in a breath of fresh, clean air. Her confession came on a night when the wind was particularly vicious, a screaming devil outside their door. The cabin felt smaller than ever, a tiny, fragile raft in a frozen sea. She was staring into the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering flames, her expression distant and sorrowful. "He was a preacher," she said suddenly, her voice empty. Eli did not say anything. He set down the piece of leather he was mending and gave her his full attention. "We were married when I was 17. I was just a girl. He was a good man then, or I believed he was. He spoke of God's love, and his voice was like honey." She paused, her hands twisting a loose thread on her blanket. "We had a son, a beautiful boy. He had my eyes." Her voice broke. She stopped, composing herself, her gaze still fixed on the flames. "He took sick in the winter. The fever came on fast. There was no doctor. We prayed. My husband. He prayed until his voice was gone. But God did not listen. Our boy died in my arms." Eli's heart ached for her. He knew that kind of loss. He knew how it hollowed a person out from the inside. "After that," she continued, her voice hardening, "the love of God curdled in him. It turned to wrath, to judgment. He said the boy was taken because of the sin in our house, because of the sin in me." She finally looked at him, her eyes dark with the memory of it. "He said I was a vessel of temptation, that my body was a snare for his soul." He began to use scripture to justify his cruelty, verses about a wife's submission, about purifying the flesh. She took a ragged breath. "He would lock me in the cellar for days, for smiling at the blacksmith, for humming a tune he thought was worldly. He said fasting would cleanse my wicked spirit." Her hand went unconsciously to her stomach, and for the first time, Eli understood the deep, animal hunger he had seen in her when she first arrived. It was not just the hunger of a few days in the snow. It was the hunger of years. "He wanted to mark me," she whispered, and now she was looking away again, at the dark corners of the cabin, "to remind me that I belonged to him, and to God, to burn the sin out of me. He would heat the iron in the fire." She trailed off, unable to say more. She did not have to. Eli could imagine the rest, the smell of burning flesh, the sound of his prayers over her screams. A silence fell over the cabin, so deep and heavy it felt like it could suffocate them both. The only sound was the fire and the storm. Eli did not move for a long time. He felt a rage building inside him, a cold, clean rage unlike any he had felt in years. It was a desire to find this man, this hollow man who used God's name as a shield for his own monstrosity, and erase him from the world. He pushed the feeling down. It would not help her now. He looked at Clara. She was trembling, her face pale with the shame that had been branded onto her soul as surely as the iron had branded her skin. She would not meet his eyes. He finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You are not the one who should feel shame." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with tears. No one had ever said that to them. She had been told she was a sinner, a harlot, a disappointment, but no one had ever told her she was blameless. His words were a small, clean light in the suffocating darkness of her guilt. After that night, the last of the ice between them melted. They grew closer in the way of two people who have seen the worst of each other's scars and have not turned away. They played cards by lamplight, her initial awkwardness giving way to a sly, competitive spirit that made him smile. He found himself listening for the sound of her laugh, a rare and precious thing, like finding a wildflower in the snow. The simmering awareness between them grew into a quiet, aching desire. It was in the way his eyes would follow her as she moved about the cabin. It was in the way she would watch his hands, strong and capable, as he repaired a broken hinge. Touches that had once been accidental now lingered. A brush of fingers as he handed her a cup of coffee, the warmth of his arm against hers as they sat before the fire. One evening, exhausted from a day of chopping wood, she leaned against him, her head finding the curve of his shoulder as if it had always belonged there. She did not say anything, but the simple act of trust was more eloquent than any words. He did not move, did not breathe, afraid he might frighten her away. He could smell the clean scent of wood smoke in her hair. "I have not felt safe in years," she murmured into his coat. He thought of his own life, the long, empty years since the fire, the solitude he had chosen as a penance. "I have not felt needed in just as long," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. They were two halves of a whole, each providing the one thing the other had been starved of, safety and purpose. The blizzard finally broke, but the cold remained, a stubborn, lingering presence. The nights were the worst, the temperature dropping so low that frost formed on the inside of the window panes. Eli would stoke the fire until it was roaring, but still, the chill would find its way in. He was woken one night by a sound. It was not a scream, it was the chattering of teeth. He looked over to the cot he had finally convinced her to use. She was curled into a tight ball. Shivering so violently the frame of the bed shook. She was not having a nightmare. She was freezing. The blankets, though thick, were not enough to fight the deep, penetrating cold that had sunk into the cabin. He got up and added more logs to the fire, but he knew it would not be enough. The cold was inside her, a ghost of the ice that had almost killed her. He stood there, hesitating, a war raging within him. He thought of her fragility, of the trust she had placed in him, but he could not stand by and watch her suffer. He walked to the cot. "Clara," he said softly. She did not respond, lost in a haze of cold-induced misery. He made his decision. He lay down on the narrow cot beside her, outside the blankets, his own body a barrier against the cold air. The shivering did not stop. He knew what he had to do, with a quiet prayer that she would understand. He slid under the blankets and pulled her against him. She was ice. Her body was rigid and shaking. And for a moment, he worried he had made a terrible mistake. But then she seemed to register his presence, the solid, living heat of him. She gave a soft sigh and turned toward him, instinctively seeking his warmth. "Do not leave," she whispered, her voice a sleepy, desperate plea against his chest. "Please." He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "I will not," he promised. She curled into him then, fitting herself against the length of his body as if she were a broken thing and he was the only thing holding her together. Her shivering began to subside, replaced by a deep, shuddering sigh of relief. He held her, his chin resting on the top of her head, breathing in her scent. He could feel every line of her, the sharp angle of her hip, the soft curve of her back. The desire he had been suppressing for weeks rose in him, fierce and undeniable. But he fought it down. This was not about that. This was about warmth. This was about chasing away the cold that had eaten at her soul for so long. They did not kiss. They did not speak another word. They simply lay there, two wounded souls adrift in a sea of silence, finding a fragile harbor in each other's arms. He held her until her breathing deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. But Eli Crow did not sleep. He lay awake until dawn, holding Clara, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his own. And he knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him, that in that moment, in the cold, dark heart of the Montana wilderness, everything had changed. The night he held her, the world outside the cabin ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of their bodies under the heavy wool blankets, the soft sound of their breathing in the dark, and the quiet, steady beat of two lonely hearts. But the morning light brought the world rushing back, cold and hard and demanding. The first thing Eli noticed was the silence from the stove. The fire had died to embers. The second thing he noticed was the gnawing emptiness in his own belly. He untangled himself from Clara carefully, her sleeping form a warm and fragile weight against him. He moved to the corner of the cabin that served as his pantry and stared at the grim reality. The flour sack was nearly flat, a few dusty pounds clinging to the bottom. The slab of bacon was gone, save for a small, fatty end piece. A handful of beans rattled in the bottom of a jar. The coffee was a memory. The wilderness that had provided him with a sanctuary was now threatening to become their tomb. The snow had not stopped. For days it had fallen, a relentless, smothering curtain of white, and the game had all gone to ground, vanished into a frozen world. "We are low," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cabin. Clara was awake now, sitting up on the cot, pulling the blankets around her shoulders. Her eyes, clear and dark, followed his gaze to the meager supplies. The easy intimacy of the night before had evaporated, replaced by the stark tension of survival. "I have to hunt," he said. It was not a question. It was a fact, as hard and unyielding as the frozen earth outside. A shadow passed over her face, a flicker of the old fear. "Out there? In this?" She gestured to the window, a pane of swirling white. "There is no choice." "Then I will come with you," she said, her voice small but firm. He turned to look at her, really look at her. The idea was absurd. She was still frail, her body a roadmap of past cruelties. But he saw something new in her expression, a resolve, a refusal to be helpless. He felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it almost choked him. The thought of her out in that storm, of leaving her alone in the cabin, were two sides of the same impossible choice. "No," he said, his tone final. "You will stay here, where it is warm, where you are safe." "I am not safe if we starve." "Eli," she countered, and the sound of his name on her lips, spoken with such earnestness, struck him. "Let me help. I can track. I can carry." "You will slow me down," he said, the words harsher than he intended. He saw her flinch. and he hated himself for it. "Clara, I will move faster alone. I can cover more ground. It is the only way." He expected her to retreat, to curl back into the silence he had first found her in. But she did not. She stood, wrapping the blanket around herself like a queen's robe, and faced him. "You are afraid to leave me," she said. It was not an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. "And you are afraid to take me, but you must do one." He ran a hand over his tired face. She was right. He was trapped by his own fear for her. "I am not that woman from the snow anymore," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You taught me how to chop wood. You taught me how to hold a rifle. Let me show you that I have learned. Or trust me to keep the fire going while you are gone. Trust me to be strong enough to be alone." He looked at her, truly saw her, not as the broken thing he had carried inside, but as the woman standing before him. Her spine was straight, her gaze was steady. The work, the food, the safety of this place had kindled a fire in her. He could not, in good conscience, smother it with his own anxieties. To deny her this was to deny her the very strength he had tried to give her. "All right," he said, the word, a surrender. "You will stay. Keep the fire hot. Bolt the door behind me. Do not open it for any reason until you hear my whistle. 3 short notes. You understand?" She nodded, a wave of relief washing over her face. "I understand. Be careful, Eli." The morning was a tense ritual of preparation. He cleaned his rifle with meticulous care, the smell of gun oil filling the cabin. He sharpened his hunting knife until the edge was a razor. He wrapped strips of salted venison, the last of his private stash, in a piece of oilcloth. Clara watched him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She moved around him, silent and efficient, filling a canteen with water from the melted snow bucket, mending a small tear in his glove. They were a team, moving in a silent, practiced rhythm that belied the short time they had known each other. When he was ready, he stood at the door, the big sheepskin coat making him seem even larger. The world outside was a maelstrom of white. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with 1,000 unspoken worries. "I will be back by nightfall," he said. "I will be here," she promised. He nodded once, then turned and stepped out into the storm, the door closing behind him with a solid, final thud. Clara rushed to the door and slid the heavy wooden bolt into place. The sound echoed in the sudden, profound silence of the cabin. She was alone. The emptiness of the small room was immediate and overwhelming. Without Eli's solid, quiet presence, the cabin felt hollow, a flimsy wooden box against the rage of the wilderness. The wind howled, its voice no longer just a sound, but a presence, whispering of isolation and danger. For a terrifying moment, she felt the old panic rising in her throat, the feeling of being trapped, helpless. She fought it down, her hands clenched into fists. She would not be that woman. She began to work. She tidied their sleeping blankets, swept the dirt floor with a broom made of twigs, and wiped down the small, rough-hewn table. The simple, domestic tasks were an anchor. They were acts of faith, a belief that Eli would return, that there would be another meal, another night by the fire. She was creating a home, not just for him, but for herself. She was claiming this space, making it her own. Her cleaning led her to his cot and the small chest at its foot that served as his table and storage. It was here he kept his mending tools, his spare ammunition, his few personal belongings. One drawer was tidy, holding whetstones and spare leather, but the one beneath it was locked. She stopped, her hand hovering over the small, tarnished brass lock. It was his. It was private. She had no right, but a deep, undeniable curiosity bloomed in her. This man had saved her life. He had clothed her, fed her, held her while she wept. He had shared his warmth, his cabin, his food, but he had not shared his past. He was a man without a history, A ghost in his own home. The locked drawer felt like the key to understanding him. She told herself she was just being thorough, that dust could get in anywhere. She ran her fingers along the edge of the chest and felt a small, loose splinter of wood. She pulled at it. It was a cleverly disguised hiding spot. Tucked inside was a small, iron key. It was cold to the touch. Her heart pounded in her chest. This felt like a betrayal of the fragile trust they had built. But the need to know, to understand the source of the sadness in his eyes, was stronger than her guilt. With trembling fingers, she inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft, metallic click. She pulled the drawer open. It did not contain letters or journals. It held only one thing, nestled on a piece of faded red velvet, a locket. It was made of silver, worn smooth with time and handling, its surface covered in a delicate pattern of etched vines. It was heavy in her palm, and it seemed to hold a faint scent of cedar and something else, something floral and sweet, like a memory of summer. She took a deep breath and pressed the small clasp. The locket sprang open. Inside, protected by two small, oval pieces of glass, were two faces. On one side was a woman. She was beautiful, with a cascade of dark hair piled on her head and a smile that was warm and genuine. Her eyes seemed to sparkle with a light that Clara felt she herself had lost long ago. On the other side was a small boy, no more than 4 or 5 years old. He was a miniature of Eli, with the same serious dark eyes, but his mouth was turned up in a mischievous grin, revealing a missing front tooth. Clara sank to the floor, the open locket resting in her hand. This was his story. This was the source of his ghosts. The woman and child were not strangers. They were his wife, his son. A wave of profound and unexpected grief washed over her, not for herself, but for him. She saw it all in a sudden, blinding flash of insight. The cabin was not a home, it was a mausoleum. His solitude was not a preference, it was a penance. He was here, at the bitter edge of the world, because he was serving a life sentence for a crime only he believed he had committed. She sat there for a long time, the silence of the cabin broken only by the wind, her gaze fixed on the smiling faces in the locket. She traced the edge of the woman's face with her fingertip, an unexplainable pang of jealousy mixing with her sorrow. This woman had known a different Eli, an Eli who smiled, who loved, who had a future. She closed the locket with a soft snap and placed it back in the drawer, locking it and hiding the key exactly where she had found it. But she could not lock away what she now knew. The day dragged on. The storm did not abate. As dusk began to bleed into the white landscape, a new fear took root. What if he did not come back? What if the storm had taken him, just as it had almost taken her? She paced the small cabin, her anxiety a living thing, coiling in her gut. She would go to the window, peer into the blinding swirl of snow, and see nothing. Then, just as the last of the light was dying, she heard it. 3 short, sharp whistles, faint against the wind, but unmistakable. Relief washed over her so powerfully her knees went weak. She fumbled with the bolt and threw the door open. Eli was there, a dark, hulking shape against the snow, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He was leading Jed, whose head was bowed low. There was no deer slung over the horse's back, only a single, scrawny rabbit hanging from the saddle. He looked up, his face etched with weariness and failure, and saw her standing in the warm, orange light of the doorway. He led the horse to the lean-to and then stumbled inside, bringing a blast of frigid air with him. He did not speak, just pulled off his frozen gloves and moved to the fire, holding his hands out to the flames. He was covered in snow, his beard thick with ice. Clara bolted the door and turned to him. She did not know what to say, how to begin, so she said nothing. She simply stood there, waiting. When he finally turned from the fire, he saw what she was holding. She had picked up the locket again, unable to leave it in the dark. It lay open in her palm. His face closed down, the weariness replaced by a stark, guarded expression. The air grew thick with all the things they had never said. "I was cleaning," she said softly, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. He did not respond. He just stared at the locket, at the faces of his ghosts brought out into the light. "She was beautiful, Eli," Clara whispered. "And your son, he has your eyes." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were not just sad, they were dead. "Their names were Sarah and Jacob," he said, his voice flat and toneless, as if he were speaking of strangers. "They died 2 years ago, in a fire." He walked to the table and sank onto the bench, his body moving like that of an old man. Clara followed, sitting opposite him. She placed the locket on the table between them, a silent testament to a life that was no more. "It was my fault," he said, his gaze fixed on the table, on a crack in the wood. "We had a small homestead, south of here. I built it myself. I was out, checking the fences after a storm. A lantern tipped over in the barn. The hay went up like tinder. It spread to the house so fast." He stopped, his throat working. "I heard Sarah screaming. I ran, but the whole world was on fire. I tried to get in, through the door, through the windows. The heat, it was like a wall. I could not get through. I could hear them. And then I could not." He held up his left hand. A thick, puckered scar ran across the back of it, a permanent reminder of the heat and his failure. "I could not save them," he whispered, the words raw and broken. "I was not fast enough. I was not strong enough. I stood there and listened to my whole world burn." He fell silent. Clara looked at his face, at the rigid set of his jaw, the unbearable pain in his eyes. She saw the full weight of the guilt he carried, a burden heavier than any mountain. Her own pain, her own history of abuse, seemed to shrink in the face of his profound, absolute loss. Without thinking, she began to cry, not for herself, but for him. Quiet, silent tears streamed down her face, tears for the woman who smiled, for the boy with the missing tooth, and for the man who had been forced to live on after they were gone. Her tears seemed to break the spell of his grief. He looked up, his expression startled, as if he were surprised that anyone could feel his pain. He slowly reached a hand across the table. He did not touch her face, did not try to wipe her tears. He simply laid his hand, palm up, on the rough wood. It was an invitation. She hesitated for only a heartbeat, then placed her own hand in his. His skin was rough, calloused, but his touch was gentle. He curled his fingers around hers. A desperate, drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. And in that simple, human connection, a current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of their shared, broken humanity. They stayed like that for a long time, the fire crackling, the storm finally beginning to die outside. Later that night, as they sat before the fire, the silence was no longer one of tension or uncertainty. It was a silence of deep, shared understanding. He turned to her, his face illuminated by the flames, and the deadness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not move. She met him halfway. Their first kiss was hesitant, trembling. It was not a kiss of passion, but of solace. It tasted of salt from her tears and of the cold winter air still clinging to him. It was a kiss that spoke of loss and survival, of pain and the barest flicker of hope. Then the kiss deepened. The gentleness gave way to a desperate, consuming hunger. The desire that had been simmering between them for weeks finally broke free. A flash fire through dry timber. It was not gentle or tender. It was raw, aching. A desperate affirmation of life in a place that had been defined by death. His hands were in her hair, on her back, pulling her close as if he could absorb her into himself. She clung to him, her hands gripping his shoulders, meeting his hunger with her own. They moved to the cot, A tangle of limbs and quiet, desperate sounds. They spent the night wrapped in each other, their bodies speaking a language of need and solace that words could never touch. It was a collision of two lonely souls, a fierce, aching union against the cold and the dark, a shared declaration that they were still alive, that they could still feel. Clara awoke in the gray light of dawn, tangled in the blankets and in Eli's arms. He was still asleep, his face peaceful for the first time she had ever seen it. The harsh lines softened. The warmth of his body was a solid, comforting presence. But as the reality of what they had done settled over her, a cold dread began to creep in. She had given herself to him, willingly, eagerly, for the first time in her life. She had chosen this, but her past was a relentless ghost. Every act of intimacy in her life had been followed by punishment, by pain, by shame. She had found a sanctuary here, a fragile peace she had never known. What if she had just destroyed it? What if this act, this moment of shared humanity, was just another sin for which she would have to pay? She slid from the bed, her movements jerky. Eli stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He saw her standing there, clutching a blanket to her chest, her face pale, her eyes wide with a familiar panic. "What if I ruined this too?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The question was a plea, a confession of her deepest fear, that she was a destructive force, that she brought ruin to everything she touched. Eli sat up, the blanket pooling around his waist. He looked at her, his gaze steady and clear. There was no anger in his eyes, no judgment, only a deep, quiet tenderness. "You did not ruin anything," he said, his voice soft but firm. He reached out, not to pull her back to bed, but to gently take her hand. "Clara, you reminded me what being alive feels like." His words were a balm, a quiet absolution that chased away the ghosts of her past. She had not ruined him. She had resurrected him. A tear slid down her cheek. But this time, it was not a tear of sorrow or fear. It was a tear of release. At that exact moment, a sound from outside shattered the fragile peace. The distinct sound of horses, more than one, their hooves crunching on the frozen snow. It was too soon for a traveler, too deliberate for a wild animal. Eli was on his feet in an instant, his body tense, all tenderness gone, replaced by a cold, watchful alertness. He moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtain. His shoulders went rigid. Clara's heart seized. "What is it?" "Riders," he said, his voice low and hard. "Two of them, armed." He watched them for a moment longer as they scanned the valley, their figures dark and menacing against the stark white snow. They were searching, methodically, purposefully. Clara moved to stand behind him, her gaze following his out the window. She saw them, the way they sat their horses, the rifles resting in the crooks of their arms, and a cold, paralyzing terror, more profound than any she had felt in the storm, gripped her. She knew them, not their faces, but what they were, what they represented. "They are his men," she breathed, the words like ice in her throat. "He is looking for me." The danger was no longer a distant memory. It was outside their door. The cabin, their tiny sanctuary of warmth and healing, had just become a trap. The world outside the window narrowed to two dark figures on horseback, stark and menacing against the endless white. The fragile peace of the morning shattered, the warmth of Eli's promise turning to ice in Clara's veins. He moved without a sound. A predator roused from its den. The tenderness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, hard focus that chilled her more than the morning air. "Get away from the window," he ordered, his voice a low growl. He was already moving, his actions swift and certain. He grabbed a thick bearskin rug from the floor. The cellar. He kicked the rug aside, revealing a square trap door she had never noticed. Its seams blended perfectly with the rough-hewn floorboards. He pried it open with the tip of his knife, revealing a dark, gaping hole, and a crude wooden ladder descending into blackness. The air that rose from it was cold and smelled of damp earth, of potatoes and decay. It smelled like a grave. Clara froze, the memory of another cellar, another kind of darkness, rising to choke her. "No," she whispered, her body trembling. "Not in the dark. I cannot." Eli turned, his face hard, but his eyes softened when he saw her terror. He gripped her arms, his fingers digging into her flesh, forcing her to look at him. "Clara, listen to me. This is not that place. This is a safe place. They will not find you here. You must go. Now." The riders were closer now, their horses plodding steadily through the deep snow, their progress slow but relentless. They would be at the door in minutes. "Do not let them take me back," she begged, her voice breaking, the words torn from the deepest part of her soul. "Eli, please, I would rather die." "They will not take you," he said, his voice a raw promise. "I will not let them." He guided her to the opening, his hands firm on her back. "Go, I will be right here." She descended the ladder, each rung a step down into her worst fears. The darkness enveloped her. It was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket. She reached the bottom, her bare feet touching the cold, packed earth. Above her, Eli's face was a pale oval in the square of light. Then he began to close the door. "Eli, wait!" she cried out, her voice a thin thread of panic. The door stopped. He looked down at her. "I am here, Clara. I am not leaving." Then the door closed, and the world vanished. She was utterly, completely alone in the black, with only the sound of her own frantic breathing and the frantic pounding of her heart against her ribs. Above, Eli worked quickly. He dragged the heavy rug back over the trap door, then moved their one heavy table to cover it. He took the rabbit from the night before and busied himself skinning it, making the cabin look, for all the world, like the solitary domain of a lone trapper. He sat with his back to the wall, his rifle lying across his lap, its metal cool and reassuring beneath his fingers. He slowed his breathing, becoming a part of the cabin's silence, and waited. The knock on the door was not a knock. It was a blow, the sound of a heavy fist against solid wood. Eli did not move. "Hello in there," a voice called out, laced with a false, oily friendliness. "We saw your smoke, just a pair of weary travelers looking for a moment's warmth." Eli remained silent. The wood of the door groaned as a heavy shoulder leaned against it. "Open the door, friend," the voice said again, the friendliness gone, replaced by a hard edge of command. "Or we will open it for you." Slowly, Eli stood. He leaned his rifle against the wall next to the door, in easy reach, and then lifted the bar. He opened the door just a crack. 2 men stood there. One was immense, a bear of a man with a thick, greasy beard and small, piggish eyes set too close together. The other was slighter, with a weasel's face and a smirk that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. It was the weasel who spoke. "Well now, look at that. Silas. He is home after all." He pushed the door open wider and stepped inside, his partner crowding in behind him, their size seeming to shrink the small cabin to the size of a closet. They brought the smell of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and menace with them. "What do you want?" Eli's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Just looking for a little hospitality," the weasel, whose name was apparently not Silas, said. His eyes darted around the cabin, taking in every detail, the single cot, the single plate on the table, and a little information. "We are looking for someone, a woman." Eli stared at him, his face a mask of indifference. "Ran off from her husband a week or so back," the man continued, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat. "A God-fearing man, the Reverend Thaddeus Kane," says his wife. "Clara was taken by a sickness of the mind, stole a horse and ran off into the wilderness. He is offering a handsome reward for her safe return." He unfolded the paper. It was a warrant, stamped with an official-looking seal, describing one Clara Kane as the fugitive property of her husband. Eli's eyes flickered over the paper, then returned to the man's face. He said nothing. The big man, Silas, grew impatient. "He asked you a question," he growled, taking a step forward. "Have you seen her?" Eli's gaze shifted to Silas. He looked the big man up and down, a flicker of something cold and dangerous in his eyes, and then dismissed him, turning his gaze back to the first man. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon in itself. It unnerved them. They were used to bluster, to fear, to lies. They did not know what to do with this absolute, unnerving stillness. "Not much of a talker, are you?" the weasel said, his smirk tightening. He began to walk around the cabin, picking things up, looking behind the curtain that partitioned off a small storage area. "Living all alone out here must do things to a man's mind, or maybe you just do not like the company." He stopped at the table, looking down at the bearskin rug. He nudged it with his boot. Eli's body tensed. "What is under the rug? Friend? A little cellar to keep your secrets in?" Eli did not move a muscle. He simply stared at the man, his silence a wall of granite. The man held his gaze for a long moment, then laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Ah, leave it. If she was here, a quiet man like you would have made a mistake by now." He turned to Silas. "Let us go. We will check the pass. She could not have gotten much further in this snow." He walked to the door, then paused, turning back to Eli. "But we will be back this way, and if we find out you have been lying to us, friend, well, the Reverend is a powerful man, and he considers that woman his property. A man who helps a thief is a thief himself, and we know how to deal with thieves." He gave Eli one last hard look. Then he and Silas were gone, the cabin door left open in their wake. Eli moved to the door, closed it, and barred it. He stood with his back to it for a long moment, listening, until the sound of their horses' hooves faded into the muffled silence of the snow. He moved the table, threw back the rug, and opened the trap door. "They are gone," he called down. A moment later, Clara's head appeared. Her face was chalk white, her eyes wide with terror. He helped her up the ladder, and as soon as her feet were on the floorboards, she collapsed against him, her body shaking uncontrollably. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, murmuring quiet words of comfort. When the shaking finally subsided, she pulled away from him, her face a mask of misery and guilt. "This is my fault," she whispered, her voice choked with self-loathing. "I brought this to you. They will be back. Eli, you heard them. They will hurt you because of me." "They will not hurt me," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You do not know that," she cried. "You do not know my husband. He will not stop. He will send more men. He will burn this place to the ground to get me back. He has done it before." She looked around the small, safe world they had built, her eyes filled with a desperate sorrow. "I have to leave, now, before they come back. I can draw them away from you." She started for the door, but he caught her arm, his grip firm but not harsh. He spun her around to face him. "You are not going anywhere," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Her talk of leaving, of sacrificing herself, had ignited a fire in him. He had lost everything he had ever loved. He would not stand by and lose the one spark of life that had found its way back into his world. "But," she started. He cut her off, his hands moving to grip her shoulders. He looked directly into her eyes, his gaze so intense it felt like it could see into her very soul. "If they want you," he said, each word a vow, spoken with a cold, terrifying calm. "They will have to come through me." And she believed him. For the first time in her life, she felt the absolute, unshakable certainty of another person's protection. She was not property. She was a person worth fighting for. The rest of the day passed in a blur of grim preparation. The fear was still there, a cold knot in Clara's stomach, but now it was overlaid with a sense of purpose. They were not just waiting for the violence to arrive. They were preparing to meet it. Eli became a different person. The quiet, grieving man was gone, replaced by a seasoned, methodical tactician. He pulled heavy nails from a coffee can and began boarding up the two small windows, leaving only a narrow slit in each, just wide enough for the barrel of a rifle. The cabin grew dark, the only light coming from the fire and a single lantern. He had her bring buckets of snow inside to melt, filling every pot and pail they had with water. He loaded his rifle, and the spare one he kept mounted over the fireplace, his movements precise and economical. He laid out the cartridges on the table, neat rows of brass and lead. He worked, and she worked with him, a silent, efficient team. She tore strips from a spare sheet to use as bandages. She stacked firewood next to the hearth. She did not feel helpless. She felt essential. They were in this together. As night fell, a heavy, expectant silence settled over the fortified cabin. The storm had passed, and the world outside was still and frozen under a sky full of cold. Indifferent stars. They knew the men would not come back in the dark, but they would come back with the dawn. This night, this single, precious night, was all they had. They ate the last of their food, the small rabbit he had caught, sharing the meat in silence. The tension was a living thing in the small, dark space. It was the tension of the last night on Earth. After they had eaten, he came to her where she sat by the fire. He knelt before her and took her hands in his. "Are you afraid?" he asked softly. She nodded, unable to speak. "Me too," he admitted, his voice a low rumble. He leaned in and kissed her, and this kiss was different from all the others. It was not born of solace or discovery. It was born of desperation. It was fierce, aching, a desperate clinging to life in the face of death. They moved to the cot, their movements urgent, their hands tearing at the layers of clothing that separated them. This time, there was no hesitation, no tenderness. It was a raw, primal claiming, a fierce and desperate act of love in a world that had shown them only cruelty. It was as if they could, through the force of their own will, create enough life and heat and feeling within the four walls of the cabin to hold back the tide of violence that was coming with the morning sun. They made love as if it were the last act they would ever perform, their bodies moving in a rhythm of grief and desire, their quiet cries lost in the crackling of the fire. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, their bodies slick with sweat, their breathing slowly returning to normal. "I want to live," she whispered into the hollow of his shoulder, the confession a surprise even to herself. "Before, when I was running, I think I just wanted it all to be over. I never wanted to die. Eli, I just did not want to be hurt anymore." He held her tighter, his arm a band of iron around her. He pressed his lips to her hair. "You will never be alone again," he promised, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. It was a vow made in the face of an uncertain dawn, a promise of a future that would most likely never come. But in that moment, it was the only truth that mattered. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to pierce the darkness when the gunshot came. It was not a warning. It was a deafening crack, and the wall of the cabin exploded inward, splinters of wood flying through the air. The siege had begun. Eli was moving before the sound had even faded, pulling her from the cot and pushing her to the floor behind it. "Stay down," he yelled, grabbing his rifle. Another shot, and another, came from different directions. The two men had returned, and they had brought more. The cabin was surrounded. Bullets thudded into the log walls, a deadly, percussive rhythm. Eli crawled to the narrow slit in the boarded-up window. He peered out, then fired. The roar of the Winchester inside the small cabin was deafening. He fired again. A cry of pain answered from the trees outside. "Reload!" he shouted, and Clara scrambled on her hands and knees to the table, her fear a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. Her hands shook, but she did as he had taught her. She grabbed cartridges, her fingers clumsy at first, then more certain. She pushed them into the loading gate of the second rifle, her movements becoming mechanical, a desperate prayer against the onslaught. The firefight was a chaos of noise and violence. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, thick and acrid. Eli moved from one window to the other, a dark, efficient shadow, laying down suppressing fire. He was a good shot, and the men outside were forced to stay behind the cover of the trees. Then he cried out. It was a sharp, grunting sound of pain. He stumbled back from the window, his left hand clamped to his right shoulder. A dark stain was already spreading through the thick fabric of his shirt. "Eli!" she screamed. He fell to one knee, his face pale, his teeth gritted in pain. "I'm all right," he gasped, but the lie was obvious. She rushed to him, heedless of the bullets still splintering the walls. She grabbed him under his good arm and dragged him away from the window, behind the relative safety of the stone hearth. His blood was warm and slick on her hands. It stained the floorboards, a bright, shocking crimson. He slumped against the wall, his rifle clattering to the floor. Outside, emboldened by the lack of returning fire, one of the men made a run for the cabin. Clara saw his shape through the narrow slit in the window, a fleeting shadow against the snow. Everything seemed to slow down. She looked at Eli, pale and bleeding. She looked at the rifle on the floor. She looked at the approaching shadow, the woman who had been afraid of the dark, who had flinched at loud noises, who had never held a weapon in her life until a few weeks ago, was gone. In her place was someone else, someone forged in fear and fire. She picked up the rifle. It was heavy, but it felt right in her hands. She crawled to the window, rested the barrel on the sill, and looked down the long, steel sight. She saw him, a man with a cruel face, his teeth bared in a grin as he ran toward their door. He was 10 yards away. She remembered Eli's words. "Squeeze, do not pull." She took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a brutal, powerful kick. The world outside the window exploded in a spray of red against the white snow. The man crumpled, his forward momentum carrying him face first into a drift. And then he was still. A stunned silence fell from outside. Then, angry, panicked shouts. The other attackers fired a few more wild shots into the cabin walls, and then she heard the sound of them retreating, crashing through the underbrush, their nerve broken. For now, they were gone. Clara let the rifle fall from her numb fingers. She stared out at the body in the snow, a dark, still shape in the pristine morning. She had taken a life. The thought did not fill her with horror or guilt. It filled her with nothing at all. She felt empty, scoured clean. She had done what she had to do. They were alive. She turned back to Eli. He was watching her, his eyes clouded with pain, but filled with a fierce, burning pride. The snow outside was stained with blood, but they were alive, and she knew, with a terrible, chilling certainty, that the men would be back. The echo of the rifle shot faded, leaving a silence that was more profound and terrifying than the noise of the battle. Outside, a man lay dead in the snow, his blood a stark, obscene stain on the morning's purity. Inside, Eli slumped against the stone hearth, his own blood a dark and spreading presence on the cabin floor. The world had been reduced to these two facts, a life taken and a life draining away. Clara moved as if in a trance. She took the strips of cloth she had torn for bandages, the whiskey from the bottle on the shelf, and a pail of clean water. The roles were now utterly reversed. She was the caregiver. He was the one who was broken and bleeding. She knelt beside him, her hands surprisingly steady. "Let me see," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He gritted his teeth, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. But he allowed her to cut away the thick wool and flannel of his shirt. The wound was ugly. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder, missing the bone, but it had left a ragged, angry tear in its wake. She had seen her husband do worse to livestock, but the sight of Eli's flesh, torn and bleeding, sent a wave of nausea through her. She swallowed it down. This was no time for weakness. "This will hurt," she warned, uncorking the whiskey bottle. "Just do it," he rasped. She poured the fiery liquid over the wound. He cried out, a sharp, guttural sound, his body arching in a spasm of pure agony. His good hand shot out and gripped her arm, his fingers digging in like a vice. She did not pull away. She held his gaze, her own eyes filled with a fierce compassion, and continued to clean the wound with a clean cloth, her movements gentle but efficient. When she was done, she packed the entry and exit wounds with clean cloth and bound his shoulder tightly, the white strips of sheet a stark contrast to his blood-soaked skin. For 2 days, he drifted in and out of a fevered sleep. She nursed him with a devotion that was born of something deeper than gratitude. It was a fierce, protective love. She bathed his face with cool water, forced sips of broth between his cracked lips, and sat by his side through the long nights, her hand resting on his forehead, a silent guardian against the encroaching shadows, just as he had once sat vigil over her. She now kept the darkness at bay for him. Outside the cabin, the world was changing. The relentless grip of winter was beginning to loosen. A subtle shift occurred in the air, a softening. During the day, the sun had a new warmth to it, and the snow began to weep, rivulets of meltwater dripping from the eaves of the cabin in a steady, rhythmic tattoo. The sound was a promise of spring, of life returning to the frozen land, but with the thaw came a new and more urgent danger. If the snow was melting, the mountain passes would soon be clear. Her husband's men could travel more easily, and they would be back. The body of their fallen comrade, now slowly being revealed by the shrinking drifts, was a testament to a feud that would not be abandoned. She looked at Eli, his face gaunt, his breathing shallow. He was weak, in no condition to fight or to run. She looked at their dwindling supplies. Nothing more than a little flour and some coffee. The cabin, their sanctuary, was now a trap, a tomb waiting to be sealed. A decision took root in her, a hard, cold certainty. They could not stay here. She had to get help. "I am going to the nearest town," she announced on the 3rd morning. Eli was awake, his fever broken, but he was weak, his voice a hoarse whisper. "No," he said, trying to push himself up and failing, falling back against the pillows with a groan. "You will not. It is too dangerous. They will be looking for you." "And they will look here, too. Eli," she countered, her voice firm. "They will come back, and next time they will bring more men. We cannot fight them all. We have no food. You need a doctor. To stay here is to die. I will not let that happen." "Clara, you cannot," he began, his voice pleading. "You taught me to survive," she said, cutting him off gently. "You taught me how to ride, how to shoot, how to be strong. Now let me use that strength to save us. I can do this." He saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes, the same resolve he had seen when she first split a log with the axe. This was not the frightened woman he had pulled from the snow. This was someone new, someone he had helped to create. To argue further was to deny the very spirit he had nurtured in her. He fell back, his expression a mixture of terror and a deep, grudging pride. That night, she prepared. She waited until his breathing had deepened into a fitful sleep. She dressed in a pair of his old trousers, which she cinched tight with a piece of rope, and one of his flannel shirts. They were too big, but they were warm and would not attract the same attention as a woman's dress. She packed a small satchel with the last of their dried meat and a skin of water. She took his rifle, its weight familiar and reassuring in her hands. Then she went to the cot and looked down at his sleeping face. She leaned down and pressed a soft, fleeting kiss to his feverish brow. "I will be back," she whispered. She slipped out of the cabin like a ghost, the night air cold and sharp against her face. She saddled Jed, the gelding's warm breath misting in the moonlight. She moved with a stealth and purpose she had not known she possessed, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She mounted the horse and urged him into the trees, not following the trail, but cutting a new path through the treacherous, half-melted snow. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every snap of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot, but she did not turn back. She rode for hours, the moon her only guide. As dawn broke, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of pink and gray, she saw it in the valley below, the town of Blackwater. It was not much more than a single muddy street lined with a collection of false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's shop, and a few scattered houses, a dirty smudge on the vast, clean canvas of the wilderness. She dismounted at the edge of town, tying Jed in a grove of aspens where he would not be easily seen. She pulled her hat down low, shadowing her face, and walked into town, the rifle held loosely in her hand. The town was just waking up. The mud in the street was ankle-deep, a thick, churned slurry of melted snow and earth. Men in heavy coats watched her as she passed, their eyes lingering. She ignored them, her gaze fixed, searching for a sign that said law offices or marshal. She saw a sign for the marshal first, and was about to head for it when she saw him. The big man, Silas. He was coming out of the saloon, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He had not seen her. Her blood ran cold. She ducked into the narrow alley between the general store and the blacksmith's shop, pressing herself into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. She peered around the corner. Silas was talking to another man, the weasel-faced one from the cabin. They were not just passing through. They were based here, waiting, hunting. She had to get out of town. She turned to retreat deeper into the alley, and a hand clamped down on her shoulder. She gasped, spinning around. A grimy, unshaven trapper stood there, a drunken leer on his face. "Well now, what have we got here?" he slurred. "A pretty little thing, all alone." "Let go of me," she said, her voice a low hiss. His leer widened. "I do not think so." He lunged for her. She did not scream. She reacted. She brought the butt of the rifle up in a sharp, brutal arc, connecting solidly with his chin. His head snapped back, his eyes rolling up, and he crumpled into the mud without a sound. But the scuffle had been heard. "Hey, what is going on over there?" a voice shouted. It was Silas. Clara did not hesitate. She ran. She flew down the alley, her boots slipping and sliding in the muck. She burst out onto a back street, dodged a freight wagon, and ran for the edge of town, for the trees where Jed was waiting. She could hear them behind her, shouting, their heavy boots pounding in pursuit. She reached the aspens, fumbling with the reins, her fingers numb with cold and fear. She threw herself onto Jed's back, kicking him into a gallop just as Silas and the other man burst from the trees. A gunshot rang out, the bullet whining past her ear. She bent low over the horse's neck, urging him on, deeper and deeper into the wilderness, not looking back, her breath coming in ragged, burning sobs. She rode until the sounds of the town and the shouts of her pursuers were long gone, until the only sound was the thundering of Jed's hooves and the frantic beating of her own heart. She had failed. She could not go back to Blackwater, but she could not return to Eli empty-handed. She remembered passing a smaller, more isolated homestead on her way down from the mountain, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. On a weathered signpost at the turnoff, a shingle had been nailed. Martha Gable, attorney at law. At the time, she had thought it odd, a lawyer so far from town. Now, it was her only hope. She found the place an hour later, a small, neat cabin with a well-tended garden just beginning to emerge from the melting snow. She approached with caution. Dismounting and walking the last 100 yards, she knocked on the door. It was opened by a woman in her late 50s, tall and wiry. with intelligent gray eyes and a face that looked like it had been carved from hickory. She held a shotgun loosely in the crook of her arm. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice calm and steady. "Are you Martha Gable?" Clara asked, her own voice trembling slightly. "I am. And who are you?" "My name is Clara," she began, then stopped. She took a breath. "My name is Clara Kane. I am in trouble. I need a lawyer." Martha Gable studied her for a long moment, her shrewd eyes taking in the men's clothing, the rifle, the mud-splattered face, and the desperate fear in her eyes. "You had better come in," she said, stepping aside and lowering the shotgun. Inside, the cabin was warm and smelled of books and wood smoke. Clara poured out her story, the words tumbling over each other in her haste and desperation. She told Martha everything: the marriage, the death of her son, her husband's cruelty, her escape, finding Eli, the attack on the cabin, the dead man in the snow. Martha listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When Clara was finished, a heavy silence fell between them. "The Reverend Thaddeus Kane," Martha said, more to herself than to Clara. "I know of him. He has a great deal of influence in this territory. He has bought politicians and he has bought lawmen. That warrant your pursuers are carrying is almost certainly a forgery, but a marshal in Blackwater would not dare to question it." Clara's heart sank. "Then there is no hope?" "I did not say that," Martha corrected her. "I said the Reverend has influence. I did not say he is without enemies. A man who uses the word of God to line his own pockets and abuse his power makes a lot of them." She looked at Clara, a flicker of something like admiration in her eyes. "You say you shot one of his men?" "I had to. He was going to kill Eli." "Self-defense is a tricky thing for a woman to claim in these parts," Martha said. "But killing a man who is actively trying to murder you on your own property, that is a good start." She stood and walked to her desk. "The marshal in Blackwater may be bought, but the circuit judge who oversees this territory, Judge Morrison, is a hard man who despises corruption. If we can get your story in front of him, and if this Eli Crow will testify on your behalf, you may have a chance." She gave Clara a piece of jerky and a fresh skin of water. "You need to get back to your man. Get him away from that cabin. It is not safe there. I will ride to Morrison's Crossing and find the judge. I will tell him your story, but you must stay alive. Clara Kane, can you do that?" "I will," Clara said, a fire of hope rekindled within her. The ride back to the mountain was filled with a new kind of energy. She was no longer just a fugitive. She was a woman with a plan, a woman with an ally. When she finally reached the cabin, she found Eli awake, sitting at the table, his face a mask of pale, cold fury. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice weak but sharp. "I went for help," she said, barring the door behind her. "I told you not to go! You could have been killed!" he raged. But she could see the terror in his eyes, the fear that he had been abandoned, that she had been captured or killed. She walked to him and began to tell him everything. The men in town, the chase, the lawyer, Martha Gable, the hope that Judge Morrison represented. As she spoke, his anger slowly melted away, replaced by a stunned astonishment, and then a profound and overwhelming pride. He reached out with his good hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. "Look at you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are not afraid of anything, are you?" "I am afraid of everything," she confessed. "But I will not let it stop me." He looked at her, his gaze filled with a love so deep it made her ache. "When I found you, I thought I was saving you," he said softly. "But you were the one who saved me." He paused, his expression becoming serious, his words carrying a weight she knew she would never forget. "You do not belong to anyone, Clara, not to your husband, not even to me. You choose who you are." They prepared to leave at dusk, packing the few belongings they had. Eli was still weak, leaning on her for support as they walked. but his spirit was strong. They were a strange pair, a wounded man and a determined woman, armed and ready to face whatever came next. Their plan was to follow the river downstream, where the terrain would be easier. They moved through the twilight, the sound of the rushing water covering the noise of their passage. They had traveled for nearly an hour when they came to a shallow crossing, the water churning white over smooth, dark stones. It was a perfect place for an ambush. The first shot came from the trees on the far bank, the bullet kicking up a spray of water at their feet. They scrambled for the cover of a rocky outcrop. The weasel-faced man stepped out from behind a pine, his rifle leveled. Eli pushed Clara behind him and fired his own rifle one-handed, the recoil jarring his wounded shoulder. The man staggered back, a look of surprise on his face, before crumpling to the ground. But then another figure emerged from the shadows. He was a tall man, dressed in the severe black coat of a preacher. He held a pistol in his hand, its barrel gleaming in the moonlight. He did not rush them. He walked with a calm, deliberate stride, his face a mask of cold, righteous fury. It was him, her husband, Thaddeus Kane. He circled around their position until he was behind them, his pistol aimed squarely at Clara's back. "Clara," he said, his voice the same honeyed poison she remembered from her nightmares. "Look what you have done. You have consorted with an outlaw. You have become a killer. I came to save your soul, and you have dragged it further into the mud." Eli tried to turn, to bring his rifle to bear, but he was too slow, his movements hampered by his wound. "I would not do that," the preacher warned, his voice like ice. He pressed the cold barrel of the pistol against the base of Clara's skull. "She is a harlot, a liar, a wife with no loyalty. She has broken her sacred vow to me and to God." Clara stood frozen, the cold metal against her skin a terrifying reminder of his absolute power over her. But then she looked at Eli, at his face, contorted in helpless fury, and something inside her snapped. The years of fear, of submission, of pain, coalesced into a single, burning point of pure, defiant rage. She was not that woman anymore. She turned slowly, her movements measured, until she was facing her husband. She looked into his cold, merciless eyes. "You already killed the part of me that could fear you," she screamed, her voice raw and full of a strength he had never heard before. And then she did the one thing he could never have predicted. She spat in his face. His expression of shock turned instantly to one of pure, murderous rage, his face contorted, the mask of piety gone, revealing the monster beneath. "You will burn for that, harlot," he hissed. He pulled the trigger. The world seemed to explode in a flash of light and a deafening roar. But Clara felt no pain. In the instant before the hammer fell, Eli had moved. With a guttural cry, he had thrown himself in front of her, his body a shield. He took the bullet meant for her, the impact throwing him backward, into her arms. The world dissolved into a deafening roar and a blinding flash of orange. Eli's body, a solid, living shield just a moment before, was thrown backward with the force of the blast, a dead weight that sent them both tumbling to the muddy ground. A high-pitched ringing filled Clara's ears. For a heartbeat. She lay stunned beneath him, his warmth a rapidly fading presence. The coppery scent of fresh blood filled the air. Her husband, Thaddeus, stood over them, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly curdled into a triumphant sneer. He had done it. He had finally excised the sin, punished the disobedient flesh. He raised the pistol again, this time to finish the job, to erase the final witness to his holy rage. But the woman he was aiming at no longer existed. The fear, the submission, the lifetime of cowering from his wrath. It had all been cauterized in the flash of the gunshot that had struck Eli. A scream tore from Clara's throat, a sound not of fear, but of pure, undiluted fury. It was the sound of a soul breaking its chains. She scrambled out from under Eli's limp body, her hands seizing the heavy Winchester he had dropped. Thaddeus hesitated, his sanctimonious cruelty momentarily thrown off balance by this sudden, violent transformation. It was a fatal hesitation. Clara raised the rifle. It was heavy, awkward, but her hands were steady. She looked down the long barrel and saw not her husband, not the man of God, but the monster who had haunted her every waking moment and tormented her every dream. She saw the cellar. She saw the iron. She saw her dead son's face twisted into a mask of her own sin. And she saw Eli, bleeding his life into the spring mud for her. She fired. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. A familiar, brutal kick. The shot echoed across the river valley. A definitive, final crack of judgment. Thaddeus staggered back, a look of profound, almost comical surprise on his face. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of the pristine white bib of his preacher's coat. He looked down at it, then back up at her, his mouth opening as if to pronounce one last condemnation. But no words came. He crumpled to his knees, then pitched forward into the shallow, churning water of the river crossing. The current tugged at his black coat, pulling him slowly downstream, a dark and empty vessel finally surrendering to the elements. Silence. A profound, deafening silence descended upon the clearing. The only sounds were the gurgle of the river and the soft sigh of the wind through the newly budding pine trees. The world was a tableau of terrible, quiet stillness. Blood, his and Eli's, mingled with the melting snow and the dark, rich mud of the thaw. The metallic tang of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Clara stood frozen for a long moment, the heavy rifle still clutched in her hands. She stared at the place where her husband had fallen, at the two other bodies that littered the clearing. It was over. The hunt, the chase, the fear. It was all over, but there was no triumph, no relief, only a vast, hollow emptiness. Then her gaze fell upon Eli, and the emptiness was filled with a pain so sharp and absolute it stole the breath from her lungs. She dropped the rifle and scrambled to his side, her hands fluttering over his still form. "Eli," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "Eli, no." He was so still. His eyes were closed, his face a waxy, bloodless gray. The front of his shirt was a sodden, gruesome mess of crimson. She gently turned him over, her hands shaking so badly she could barely function. The bullet had entered his chest. It had not been a glancing blow like the first one. This one was bad. She laid his head in her lap, her fingers stroking the matted, sweaty hair back from his forehead. "No, no, please, no," she sobbed, the words a desperate, useless prayer. She had just found him. She had just found a reason to live, a reason to fight. She could not lose him now. Tears streamed down her face, dripping onto his pale cheeks, mingling with the blood and the mud. She pressed her ear to his chest, listening, praying for the steady, familiar beat of his heart. But there was nothing, only a terrible, final silence. "Do not leave me," she wept, her body shaking with great, racking sobs. "Please, Eli, you promised I would not be alone." She bent over him, her forehead pressed to his, her grief a physical weight that was crushing the very life from her. And then she felt it. A flutter, a weak, shallow rise and fall of his chest against hers, a faint, rattling cough. Her head snapped up, his eyelids flickered. A soft groan escaped his lips. He was alive, barely, a fragile, guttering flame in a hurricane. But he was alive. The grief was instantly replaced by a will of pure iron. The time for tears was over. The time for fighting had returned. She had to get him to Martha Gable's homestead. It was his only chance. "Stay with me, Eli," she commanded, her voice fierce and strong. "You hear me? You are not allowed to die." Getting him onto Jed's back was the hardest thing she had ever done. He was a dead weight, his body limp and unresponsive. She was small, and the day's violence and adrenaline had left her drained and trembling. She tried to lift him, her muscles screaming in protest, and failed. She tried again, gritting her teeth, a guttural cry of effort tearing from her throat. She used her legs, her back, her sheer, desperate will. And somehow, inch by agonizing inch, she managed to haul him up and drape him over the saddle, his head and arms hanging down one side, his legs the other. She secured him with rope, her hands working with a frantic, clumsy haste. Then she took the reins and began the long, nightmarish walk, pulling the horse, her hand resting on Eli's back, as if she could will her own life force into him through her touch. The journey was a blur of mud and fear and whispered prayers. Every step was a battle. She talked to him constantly, her voice a low, steady murmur against the sounds of the wilderness. She told him about the home they would build, about the garden she would plant. She told him he was the best man she had ever known. She told him she loved him. She did not know if he could hear her, but she could not stop. The words were a lifeline, a rope she was throwing down into the darkness to pull him back from the edge. It was nearly dawn when she finally stumbled out of the trees and saw the light in Martha Gable's window. She was covered in mud and blood, barely able to stand, but she found the last of her strength and screamed, "Help! Please! Somebody help!" The door flew open, and Martha stood there, her shotgun in her hand. Her calm demeanor shattered for a moment when she saw the state of them. "Good God, child!" she breathed. She shouted back into the house, and a moment later, a stout, grim-faced man, the marshal, Clara presumed, appeared behind her. Together, they got Eli off the horse and carried him inside, laying him gently on the sturdy wooden table in the center of the room. He was paler than before, his breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. The next few hours were a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Martha, it turned out, was as skilled a nurse as she was a lawyer. She sent the marshal to fetch the nearest doctor, a man who lived a few miles down the river. Then she and Clara went to work. They cut away Eli's bloody shirt, and Martha's face grew grim. "The bullet is still in there," she said, her voice low. "And it is deep, close to the lung." They cleaned the wound as best they could, their movements efficient and synchronized. Clara held Eli's hand, her grip tight, her gaze never leaving his face, willing him to hold on. The marshal returned with a grizzled, weary-looking man who carried a black leather bag. The doctor took one look at Eli and shook his head. "The odds are not good," he said bluntly. He then proceeded to pour a generous amount of whiskey down Eli's throat, and then his own, before taking out a long, thin probe and a wicked-looking knife. "You had best wait outside, ma'am," he said to Clara. She refused. She stood in the corner of the room, her back pressed against the wall, and watched as the doctor worked by the light of 3 oil lamps. She watched and she prayed. An eternity later, the doctor dropped a small, misshapen piece of lead into a metal bowl with a soft clink. He stitched the wound closed with a curved needle and thick black thread. "He is strong," the doctor said, wiping his hands on a rag. "That is the only thing he has in his favor. The rest is up to God and a good deal of luck." The marshal, a man named Silas Croft, who had a kind face and tired eyes, sat Clara down with a cup of hot coffee. He listened patiently as she recounted the events of the ambush, her voice flat and exhausted. Martha stood by her side, a silent, supportive presence. When she was finished, the marshal nodded slowly. "We found the bodies," he said. "The 2 men from the cabin and the Reverend Kane. It all matches your story." He pulled out the warrant he had taken from one of the men. "Martha was right. This is a forgery. The seal is fake, and Judge Morrison never signed it." He looked at her, his expression softening. "With the Reverend dead, and with Mr. Crow's testimony, assuming he lives to give it, you are no longer a fugitive. Mrs. Kane. As far as the law in this territory is concerned, you are a free woman." A free woman. The words did not seem real. She had been someone's daughter, then someone's wife, then someone's property, then someone's fugitive. The idea of simply being Clara was too vast to comprehend. She bowed her head and, for the first time since Eli had fallen, she allowed herself to weep, not from fear or grief, but from the overwhelming, crushing weight of her own freedom. Weeks passed. Spring arrived in earnest, breathing life and color back into the world. The snow vanished, replaced by a carpet of green grass and wildflowers. And in the small guest room of Martha Gable's cabin, Eli Crow slowly, stubbornly, refused to die. Clara never left his side. She was his constant shadow, his anchor to the living world. She changed his bandages, bathed his face, and spoon-fed him broth and soup. When he was strong enough, she would read to him for hours, her voice a low, soothing melody in the quiet room. She read from books of poetry and adventure stories from Martha's small but well-stocked library. He recovered at a glacial pace. There were days when the fever would return, when his breathing would become ragged, and she would be gripped by the cold fear of losing him. But each time, he would fight his way back, his innate strength and his will to live, a will she knew was for her, pulling him through. They talked for hours, filling in the empty spaces of their pasts. He told her about Sarah and Jacob, not with the raw, broken grief of before, but with a quiet, sad fondness, sharing memories of a life filled with love. And she, in turn, told him more about Kansas, about the little boy she had lost, about the woman she had been before the preacher's cruelty had tried to erase her. They were building a new world together, a world made of words and trust and shared history. When he was finally strong enough to sit up in a chair by the window, they began to plan. "I cannot go back to that cabin," he said one afternoon, his gaze on the distant mountains. "Too many ghosts there, mine and ours." "Then we will find a new place," she said simply. With Martha's help, they found 100 acres of land for sale, not far from the river. It had a stand of good timber, a meadow that was perfect for grazing, and a gentle slope that caught the morning sun. They used the money from the sale of Eli's traps and pelts, and a small inheritance Clara had from her mother that she had sewn into the hem of her dress, to buy it. It was theirs. The day they left Martha's homestead was a day of tearful goodbyes and heartfelt promises to visit. They rode out together, Eli still weak but sitting tall in the saddle, and Clara riding beside him, her hand often reaching out to rest on his arm, reassuring herself he was really there. They lived in a tent while they built their home. It was hard, back-breaking work, but it was joyful work. Every log they felled, every stone they laid for the foundation, was an act of creation, an act of hope. They were not building a fortress against the world. They were building a home, a place with wide windows to let in the light and a porch to watch the sun set. It was not a cabin of survival. It was a home of choice. One warm evening in late summer, the house was finished. A soft breeze was blowing down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and wild clover. The sky was a deep, star-dusted velvet. Clara stood in the meadow, barefoot in the cool, damp grass. She had spent so long being cold, so long being afraid. But now, she was warm. She was safe. She was home. She closed her eyes, the wind soft in her hair, and she whispered the words into the darkness, not to a phantom in a fever dream, but to the quiet, steady man she loved. "I need you tonight." She heard the soft sound of his footsteps in the grass behind her. He walked to her, his steps no longer labored. His strength returned. He did not speak, but wrapped a thick, warm blanket around her shoulders. Pulling her back against his chest, he held her there, his arms a familiar, safe harbor. "You saved me first, Clara," he said softly, his voice a low rumble against her ear. She turned in his arms to face him, the blanket falling around them both. She looked up into his face. his familiar, beloved face, scarred and weathered but beautiful to her. The ghosts were gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, quiet love. He lowered his head and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that held all the promises of all their tomorrows. Then he took her hand, and in the soft, golden lamplight spilling from the window of the home they had built together, to the quiet music of the crickets and the wind, two wounded souls, finally warm, began to dance. Thank you for listening. Please comment where you are from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts.